It's the Philosopher's Zone. And what happens if you take men out of the equation?
During the Second World War, the men who went up to university took very short courses, so they would only be at university for 1 year, and then they would be conscripted to join the army. So what this meant was that there were almost no men in the universities. Unlike the men, the women were encouraged to complete their degrees. And so this was a kind of unique moment at the end of the 1930s, 1940s, where suddenly Oxford philosophy and other British universities were dominated by women rather than men. Mary Midgley, who's one of this group of women and who's still alive, she said, yes, well, that is why we flourished. It was because there were fewer men around.
The golden age of female philosophy, as Mary Midgley called it. Now in her 90s, Mary is the remaining member of a remarkable group of women philosophers. Their flourishing during the war might lend something to the simmering debate over the place of women in philosophy and beyond. Mary herself later, but here's Eleanor Gordon-Smith with the rest.
Last year on The Philosopher's Zone, we talked to David Papineau, who'd written a review of a book by Fiona Jenkins and Katrina Hutchinson called Women in Philosophy. In his review, Papineau made a controversial case for why there are so few women at higher levels of philosophy. He said it might be the competitive, adversarial nature of the classroom, that there's a kind of male competitiveness that makes women feel unwelcome, but it might also be that academic philosophy has turned into a discipline that advances fiddly and self-indulgent arguments, and that women are, simply put, smart enough not to do it. As it turns out, there's a slice of recent history that might shine some light on this argument and on how women interact with academic philosophy. Because for a brief, shining moment in the early 20th century, Oxford produced 4 titans of philosophy, and they were all women. Because most men, of course, were engaged in military service. In fact, one of those women, Mary Midgley, called it the golden age in philosophy. Rachel Wiseman of Durham University is running a project called In Parentheses to bring those women more recognition. So why hasn't more been made of these 4 remarkable women as a group? Elizabeth Anscombe, Iris Murdoch, Philippa Foot, and Mary Midgley.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? In a way, lots of people know about each of them, but we don't know about them as a group. And I think when we first started looking at this group of women, we expected to find 4 women philosophers who happened to be friends, but did very, very different kinds of philosophy. And what we found instead was that when you start to read their philosophical works together, a kind of collective perspective emerges. So that makes it even worse that we don't know about them as a collective, because it turns out that when you read their work together, it's kind of mutually enforcing and mutually illuminating. So we're missing out kind of doubly by not knowing about them as a group.
These are women who aren't just interesting from the point of view of being unusual by their gender, they're also unusual for the fact that they're sort of titans of philosophy. What sorts of contributions did they make to the discipline?
I think this is maybe like part of the answer to your question about why we don't know about them as a collective, is they each contributed in what looked like very different ways. So I'll say a little bit first about what each of them did on their own, and then maybe I could try and say how actually we can see those as part of the same project. So Elizabeth Anscombe is probably, for a long time, was most famous as the translator of Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. Her most famous 2 works are a little monograph called Intention, which is about the metaphysics of action, in a way, and then a short essay called Modern Moral Philosophy. Then there's Philippa Foot, so she's a famous ethicist. Most people who are working on her are working in the field of virtue ethics. Then there's Mary Midgley. Now she is, well, what would we call her? She's much more well known as a kind of public intellectual, but she writes a lot on scientism, a lot about kind of culture and trying to understand what philosophers can contribute, if you like, to public life. And then there's Iris Murdoch, who, although she was an incredible, well, until the 1950s, she was known as a philosopher who wrote novels. And now she's known as a novelist who was once a philosopher. And so I think that she hasn't been really thought of as a philosopher until very recently. So you've got these four women who, if you like, you'd only ever come across one of them if you were sort of a specialist. Now, what's really exciting about reading them all together is that you see that Anscombe's account of action is a precondition for Foote's moral philosophy, and that Midgley's attack on scientism is part of the same attack on the same worldview that Murdoch is talking about in The Sovereignty of the Good, and that all of them together are engaged in a sort of project against non-cognitivism and Humean moral psychology and kind of the sort of analytic philosophy or empiricist philosophy that was prevalent in Oxford in the 1940s and 50s, and which is still, in a way, the kind of prevailing model within analytic philosophy today. So it looks superficially like they're doing very different things, but when you start reading them together, you're sort of, wow, actually, it was one big project that they were sort of doing together, if you like.
And were they working together? Were they kind of engaged in projects together and talking about their work together?
During the war, they were taught by philosophers, if you like, of the previous generation, because all the young philosophers and all the philosophers that came to dominate Oxford in the 1940s and 50s, so people like A.J. Ayer and Gilbert Ryle and R.M. Hare, Stuart Hampshire, they were all away at war. So instead of being taught that kind of philosophy, they were taught philosophy by people like Donald Mackinnon, so Kantians or idealists or people who were scholars of Plato and Aristotle. So they were given a kind of very unfashionable education that was grounded in sort of ethics, I suppose. And then after the war, all these young men came back and they were doing something that Anscombe and Foote and Midgley and Murdoch just didn't recognise as what they'd been doing. And so Mary Midgley tells these fantastic stories of them kind of meeting up and just unified by this sense that this can't be right. You know, what's now being done isn't what we recognise as philosophy. And so the papers that were coming out that they write in that early period, so in sort of up until I'd say the mid-1950s, you can see them each working out in different ways of saying no, so ways of resisting the philosophical perspective and the philosophical method that they saw as wrong. So they each do it in different ways. It's not like they have a set of doctrines that they all sort of sign up to, but they have a sort of common enemy and they're all sort of feeling around for the way that they can best attack that, if you like. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It's a very different model of a kind of philosophical school, if you like. And that's one of the things that we've become quite interested in this project is, you know, what is it for people to do philosophy together? You know, does it require that we all sign up to a particular set of doctrines and then argue with anybody who doesn't agree with them? Or is there a different way of thinking about what it is to have a kind of a philosophical school or a philosophical collaboration, if you like?
What's the significance of the fact that there aren't very many men around at this point? How does this help them flourish?
I think that's a really good question. So one thing is they just got more attention. So it wasn't just that there were fewer men around, there were just fewer people around. So the classes are much smaller. A second thing that is more to do with there being fewer men, but also is to do with the amount of attention that they could get. Well, Mary Midgley says, look, in these classes, not only were there very few men, well, the men that they were conscientious objectors, they were refugees, they were people who had been deemed unfit for war duty. And she says, she has this lovely phrase, she says, you know, they weren't very much interested in arguing. So Mary says that what was different about those wartime classes was the kind of competitive argument winning and point scoring that is perhaps typical of philosophical seminars was just absent. And she says in those wartime classes, we were much more interested in understanding this deeply puzzling world than in trying to put each other down. So I think certainly Mary thinks that it was not just the absence of men, but the fact that there weren't the men around created a kind of a context within which women could be heard. That's one answer. I think what I've just been alluding to as well was that there was something particular about the particular time that they were at university, because had there not been the war, then they would have been taught by philosophers like A.J. Ayer, they would have been in class with R.M. Haar, they would have had a very different philosophical education to the one that they got. So there's also, I think, something that is just particular to that kind of moment in British philosophy. One thing that I also think is really important, and this is something that we've been trying to bring out through the work that we've been doing with our undergraduates, that there was something about the fact that they were able to sort of get started in philosophy and develop a kind of philosophical identity without that being under constant attack. And by the time the men came back and the kind of normal service resumed, so lots of competing at winning arguments, these women had already had a kind of space in which they could develop as philosophers. And that gave them the confidence that when they saw something that they thought was silly or wrong or immoral, they had the confidence to say no to it, rather than what often happens, I think, is you start to think, well, obviously I'm missing something. If all these clever people are doing it, then, it must be that there's something wrong with me.
Do you think it's just luck that these women happened to be such intellectual powerhouses at the time that we were listening to them? Or do you think that if we'd picked any generation of female philosophers at Oxford and given them this opportunity, that they would have been comparable in output?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's important to remember that when these women were born, it wasn't even possible to graduate from Oxford as a woman. So the period of women being educated, they're pretty close to the start of it. So Oxford only started awarding degrees to women in 1920. And just like as another kind of weird fact, it was only in 1925 that women were allowed to move around the university without a male chaperone. So these women are really kind of at the beginning in terms of, there just being enough women around who could form a kind of collaboration. Whether if there'd been another war in 1950 or there was another one tomorrow and suddenly the women had the run of the place, you'd get something similar going up. I don't know. I mean, it's definitely the case that these women are brilliant. But then there's a lot of brilliant women in undergraduate courses in philosophy who just vanish. So I don't know.
Rachel Wiseman of Durham University on the golden age of female philosophy. And now to the woman who coined that term, the last remaining member of that remarkable group who, through circumstance, found themselves in a most interesting social and academic experiment. What do you think would have happened to you and Iris Murdoch and Philippa Foot and Elizabeth Anscombe if there had been more men around?
He simply shouldn't have been listened to the same extent. I know this is so because I've often been in classes where it's happened. The woman is starting to talk and the man just talks over her and doesn't hear her. They don't notice. I'm afraid it happens terribly easily. Yes, I know this is so because since the war, I have often been in philosophical meetings and I've seen it happen, and partly simply a matter of the loudness of the voice, but it's also a matter of how you've always been treated.
Did that relative equality of numbers between men and women make a difference to how classrooms felt?
Yes, it very well did. I've been often enough in university classes since then to know how much more the men shout, how much more regularly they shout, how much more quickly they shout than the women, even when the numbers are relatively equal. There was one occasion when the Department of Social Studies in my university had a big meeting for some reason, and it was nearly all women. And the questions started being asked, and the questions were all being asked by men. And there was about 10 of them in a really an audience of 100. And I was just drawing breath to say, where are these women when it all ran over? But it was the customs of the time, and to some extent it happened in schools too, and I'm afraid it probably still does. That if you've got a mixed class, who's going to talk up? It's going to be the men. And it's not exactly a vice, but it's unfortunate. And the effect is, of course, that the women tend to wait and see what's going to happen. And if it isn't anything they're interested in, they just don't bother. So, I'm afraid this is a sort of lasting trouble. And it wouldn't have probably struck me if I hadn't been in this highly exceptional situation.
So, does Mary's golden age tell us anything about now? Does something overly competitive arise when men step into the room, which might be confronting for women? Fiona Jenkins is an Australian philosopher and one of the editors of the book Women in Philosophy, which David Papineau reviewed. The review that turned up the heat on the debate about women and philosophy. Is part of your thought that those sorts of standards of hyper-competitive excellence might be unfriendly to women?
Well, I'm a bit wary about that kind of argument because I think that you very quickly get into a kind of gender essentialism and gender stereotyping. Oh, women just don't like competition, or they prefer other things. They're too sensible for this. These kind of lines pop out all the time. And I think that's very problematic. Some women do really enjoy the competitive aspect. Women are different. They're not all identical to one another, just as men are different. They're not all identical. And so we have to be very wary of the role that these kinds of explanation are playing for us. I think what's true is that where you have very powerful competitive schemas that are predicated on there being these quite distorted kind of background pictures of the top journals, how they reflect a certain kind of masculinism in the profession, then sure, women have reasons for not wanting to engage in that kind of competition. But to say that women just don't like competition or they just can't cope with the fray of debate that we have in philosophy, I think that's really a problematic way of casting it.
What are some of the reasons that women might choose not to engage with that sort of thing?
Well, I think certainly an experience I've had many a time is that if I engage in, robust debate at a seminar or something with someone, with myself thinking this is very much part of how things are being done, people will be very affronted by what I've said and take it to be very aggressive. So I think one of the issues for women here is that they are held to a double standard, the expectation that you will not come across as aggressive, and indeed the bar for you being aggressive is very low, that you are expected to be much gentler in your approach to others. I think that's a very significant factor in how far women can participate in these sorts of lively debates that we often have in philosophy. But I think another aspect of that, again, is the kind of background conditions. I mean, I will frequently experience that I share so little in common with some of my male colleagues in terms of my understanding of philosophy, my sense of what's important to discuss, my sensibility, if you like, about the discipline, that it's very hard from that baseline to engage in constructive discussion. So again, one of the things that we see happening with women in philosophy, women who have PhDs in philosophy, often gravitate into cognate disciplines. So women who've studied philosophy of language, for example, will move into linguistics. The move out of continental philosophy into gender studies or cultural theory. These are very common patterns. And in a sense, what you're seeing there, I think, is that the kinds of questions that are deemed to be important, the kind of sensibility about the discipline, actually is so incompatible for people who've taken certain research trajectories with the mainstream of the discipline that they move out into other fields.
We spoke to David Papineau a couple of weeks ago, who essentially argued that women are, by and large, making the accurate judgment that what's required in academic philosophy these days to succeed is not worth their time. What do you make of that argument?
Well, again, I think a little bit of gender essentialism is going on there, and it's problematic only to think about what women are choosing to do there as opposed to how they're being pushed out by various kinds of chilly climate in the discipline. But I think there's an aspect of what he says that I agree with. I mean, I think it's true that philosophy has become very formalistic, very technical, often very narrow in its concerns. I think you would have to raise the question why that wouldn't put off men as much as it puts off women. One of the things that I think is interesting there is that when a discipline like philosophy rejects, to a certain extent, its much broader, humanistic, interpretative kind of dimensions, and moves in a direction that is far more framed by logic, by analysis, by, if you like, reason in a kind of hard sense. One of the things I think is going on there is that you're claiming a certain kind of authoritative space for the discipline. So we know that these are very beleaguered times for humanities research, that disciplines that are seen as soft or relativistic or unable to guarantee their standards of excellence are not treated well within our current evaluation frameworks. And my sense is that one of the things that's gone on with philosophy over the last 20 years is that it has, partly strategically, partly because it carries this very sort of heavy historical weight, it's moved in a direction where it is more able to appear as a kind of hard discipline, more like the sciences, let's say, more like formal mathematical kinds of discipline. And I think there's a huge price that's paid for that, not just in terms of certain people being disappointed in that, feeling like it's not what they thought philosophy was going to be. It's not what they, is often an experience of students, I think, that they have read in philosophy and they expect it to be full of exciting ideas, and then it becomes very dry and formal. But besides that, I think there is, there's a part of this story which is about philosophy having in some respects missed an opportunity to engage with the really seismic social and cultural revolutions of feminism, of civil rights movements, of changes in its demographic that might really have, and of course in certain respects have opened it up to a whole new set of exciting questions. And so there's a much bigger story to tell than I think Papineau captures about what it is that's happened to philosophy and what's disappointing about that trajectory.
Fiona Jenkins, Associate Professor in the School of Philosophy at the Australian National University and co-editor with Katrina Hutchinson of Women in Philosophy, What Needs to Change? Could you tell us a bit about what was so interesting or exciting about these times for women in philosophy?
Well, I think orthodox moral philosophy was becoming very bad. Something had gone wrong with it and had been going wrong with it for some time, in that people were concentrating on a number of rather detailed questions and were losing the wider sense of what morality does in people's lives. Pretty quickly, we got talking and we got thinking there's something wrong. in the time between then and now, the bad fashion in moral philosophy has been dying out slightly anyway. So that the reason why this is being shouted about now, I'm suggesting, is that something which was perfectly obviously sensible that we were saying then is suddenly becoming sayable now. That's my explanation of why we're suddenly almost in fashion today. You see, I'm in my 90s, and the others, I'm afraid, are dead. So it's a bit late, but it's better than ever.
Mary Midgley on Then and Now. And her book, Can't We Make Moral Judgments, the classic from 25 years ago, has just been reissued. Thanks today to Diane Dean and Mark Don. I'm Eleanor Gordon-Smith, and you've been in the Philosopher's Zone, on air and online, celebrating International Women's Day.